Hi everyone, and in this very last and fourth video of week one, we're going to talk about the Pentateuch and the documentary hypothesis. Okay. Now, as I explained in the last lecture, what we will be studying in this semester is the Tanakh, okay, our group of texts in the Tanakh, and we're going to start with the first part of the Tanakh, the Torah, or the Pentateuch, okay, another name for the Torah. Now, when you start reading the Hebrew Bible, okay, you usually begin with the Tanakh, with the Torah, okay, or the Pentateuch, okay. When you start reading it, you will realize that the stories do not sound 100% coherent, okay. Just a caveat here, this video, unlike the last video, you don't need to really see anything, so if you want, you can actually just play me as an audio, okay, or listen to it kind of as a podcast, okay, if you want. Okay, so when you start reading it, you'll realize that the text is not 100% coherent. In other words, there are repetitions, okay, small discrepancies, maybe slight variations on what God is called, okay, and other stylistic differences, okay. So for example, Genesis 1, Genesis 1, as I'll talk about next week, begins with this very high, lofty God, okay, this almost remote deity that sort of creates via voice, okay. However, by the time you get into, chapter 2, Genesis 2, 4, and following, all of a sudden, the way that God is portrayed changes. All of a sudden, God is very human-like. He's anthropomorphic, another fancy word for being human-like. He's walking around. He's planting a garden, kind of playing potter, okay, and so forth, okay? So now, careful readers and scholars who have read the Hebrew Bible also notice these same inconsistencies, oddities, and discrepancies. And they thought up of a theory called the documentary hypothesis to explain why the biblical text has these issues, these divergences, okay? Now, think about the term documentary hypothesis, okay? And what it means, okay? First of all, the term documentary hypothesis tells you that this hypothesis is about documents or written sources, okay? The other part of the term tells you what? That it's a hypothesis, meaning that there is no proof, okay? It's kind of like a supported assumption, okay? And it's important to keep this in mind, that this is a hypothesis about documents, okay? Because though this hypothesis is generally accepted, and it's the starting point for almost all scholarship on the Hebrew Bible, there are scholars who of late, have question it, okay, and have even expressed outright doubts about it, okay? And the reason why you'll see in a minute, okay? Now, it's not only, early readers and scholars, okay, the Bible has been read for a really long time, okay, and early readers also, they're not stupid, right? They also realize that there were inconsistencies, okay? However, for a variety of reasons, having to do with maybe persecution and whatever, okay, for a long time, okay, even though they realized that there were discrepancies, the author of the Pentateuch, the Torah, was assumed to be Moses for a variety of reasons, okay? And the main reason is because if you think the Bible is inspired, okay, if somehow this biblical text is related to God in some ways, okay, it's likely that God did not write it himself. Okay, he probably used a human intermediary to write down the text. And of course, if you saw the Christian Bale movie, Gods and Kings, one of the most well-known intermediaries, to God was Moses. Okay, and this was in part why Moses was assumed to be originally the author, the scribal intermediary for the Pentateuch. Okay, of course he's a big character. Okay, now beginning in the Middle Ages or so, there were this kind of, you get the beginnings of these kind of scholar readers that start to maybe more loudly question whether Moses really, was he really the one that wrote the Pentateuch down? Okay, so you have Thomas Hobbes, famous political scientist, he starts questioning it. You also have another very famous sort of thinker, Baruch or Benedict Spinoza, start wondering about it. Okay, and indeed, if you look at the text, there's some hints that it might not have been Moses. Okay, so for example, in Deuteronomy 34, okay, it describes Moses' death and burial. Okay, so if you think that the text was written by Moses, these kind of attentive readers ask, well, if he was the writer, how could he have written about his own death and burial? Okay, now the rabbis have a very interesting answer to this. They say, well, Moses wrote this down while weeping, and it's a very kind of nice way to make sense of it. There were other discrepancies though, okay? So for example, in a variety of places in the Pentateuch, it says, this little line, that the Canaanites were then in the land, okay? And notice what that line is saying. Were then in the land, as if the person writing it down is coming from a point in time when they are no longer, the Canaanites that are no longer in the land, as if they're looking in hindsight in the past, okay? And of course, considering that the Canaanites were indeed in the land during the time of Moses, okay, again, you have some hints that Moses might not have been the author or the human intermediary writer of the Bible, okay? In 1678, a priest named Richard Simon wrote a book which argued that basic point. Okay, the Pentateuch was not written by Moses because of these details. Okay, his book was a little too modern for his times. Was banned and burned. Okay, and notice that there is something that he is saying by this that was so offensive or dangerous to some that they needed to ban and burn his books. Okay, so at this point, if we were having kind of live class, I would say, well, what does the authorship have to do with the authority of the Bible? Why is this so threatening? Okay, now, however, again, other scholars, especially as the timeline moved on, other scholars also begin to read the text very carefully and question Mosaic authorship. Okay, so for example, you don't need to remember any of this, but a French scholar, okay, in these 16th, 17th century, realized, for example, that there were two names for God being used: Yahweh, okay, translated in your Bible as the Lord in kind of small caps, okay, and also Elohim, which means the gods, or which means gods, okay, but is always translated as singular in your text. Okay, can go into that later. At which point, and so looking at that evidence, this scholar said, well, okay, if it was written by Moses, seems like Moses had more than one source. Okay. Moving along from there, finally, a German scholar named Julius Wellhausen, okay, along with another scholar named Karl Graf, okay, whose work he was kind of utilizing, came up with this thing called the documentary hypothesis, okay, and the documentary hypothesis, because of who came up with it, sometimes is referred to as the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, or even the documentary theory, but the documentary hypothesis, I mean, it's generally known by that term. Okay, and what Wellhausen argued in the documentary hypothesis, right, is that he said that the Torah or the Pentateuch, notice it's only the Torah, only the Pentateuch, though there's arguments about this, that the Torah or the Pentateuch was composed of 4 sources or documents, okay, designated as J, E, P, and D. And these documents came from different time periods and reflected different concerns. Okay, now, okay, so I'm going to go over these documents, okay, and one of your assignments for this week is to go over in your groups, if you have time after the introduction, this little sheet called the documentary hypothesis worksheet, where I ask you to kind of take these different biblical texts and kind of say, well, is this J, E, P, or D? Okay, and please fill it in and kind of upload it as an assignment to the website. I'm not checking to see how many you get right. Okay, so it's not correct that way. I'm just saying that you tried it and gave it a whirl. Okay. So the documentary hypothesis said that the Pentateuch is composed of 4 different documents written by different groups of people, okay, over a period of time, which was then put together, okay, to form the Pentateuch. Caveat. Some scholars argue that these 4 documents were used not only to form the Pentateuch, but also the Hexateuch, the first 6 books of the Bible. Okay, therefore, some people say Joshua also shows evidence of these documents. Okay, whatever. Anyway, going right on. Okay, so, okay, the documentary hypothesis. Okay, and notice, okay, when you say that the Pentateuch was formed by 4 documents coming from different times, written by different people that were put together. Okay, notice that there are some interesting assumptions underlying this. Okay, and the first assumption is that the text is not stable. Okay, or another way to put it is that notice that by saying that, you're assuming that the text changed over a period of time through a lengthy process, much of which we don't have access to. Okay, or another way to put it is that you're assuming that the text did not drop out of the sky by God, and therefore does not necessarily reflect one singular mind, that of God's, but many minds, many thoughts, many motivations. Okay, and notice how that may change your vision of the authority of the text. Okay, and maybe therefore of its canonicity. Okay, and it is for these reasons that the documentary hypothesis was deemed so dangerous. Okay, there are other assumptions underlying this idea as well, which I'll talk about after I talk about the sources. Okay, so the first source, the earliest source, is called the J source, okay, or the Yahwistic source, okay, and it's called the J source or the Yahwistic source, because in German the letter J has a Y sound. Okay, it's confusing. Okay. This is the earliest source, okay, dated to around the 10th century, okay, and this is the 10th century is the period of David. Okay, and you say, well, why is the earlier source, dated earliest to David? Well, because you need a lot of systems in place before you can have scribes writing stuff down. Okay, so if you're like moving to and fro, trying to, farm or trying to follow animal herds, you don't have really, time or the resources to write stuff down. Okay, so the earliest source, a J source. Okay, and it's called the J source or the Yahwistic source. It's because the name used for God in the J source, okay, is Yahweh, translated, like I said, as the Lord in small caps in your Bibles. Okay, and the Yahwistic source or the J source uses Yahweh from the very beginning. Okay, and I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to the next source. Okay, in the J source, God is very human-like, very close to the ground almost, very anthropomorphic. He acts like a human being. He makes clothes, he walks around, he plants things, he comes down to see how things are going, okay? He smells the sacrifices, okay? Like I said, most people date the J source to about the 10th century, the time of David, okay? Most people kind of locate the J source. They say the J source come from the south, okay, or Judah. Now, caveat. Israel, the name Israel is a nation, okay, and the nation, unfortunately, only remains united, one nation. These 12 tribes constitute the one nation of Israel only under the reigns of David and Solomon. Okay, after Solomon, the Israel breaks up into 2 nations, okay, called the South, okay, called Judah or South Israel, okay, and the North, okay, and the North is called a variety of things. Sometimes it's called the North, sometimes it's called Samaria because it becomes the province of Samaria, okay. Sometimes it's also confusingly just called North Israel. Okay, and what you'll see when you study the biblical text is that we think that different texts either come from the south or the north. Okay, so the J source we think come from the south. Okay, and it's kind of easy to remember. In the J source the J source comes from Judah or the south. Okay, next source. The next source is the E source. Okay, or the Elohistic source. Okay, and the reason why it's called that is because, of course, instead of using Yahweh from the very beginning, okay, the E source uses the term Elohim or God for God, or El, okay, for short, for God until Exodus 3. Okay, well, what happens in Exodus 3? In Exodus 3, you have that lovely scene where Moses encounters, God in a burning bush, and then, God tells them his name is Yahweh after some, stalling tactics, okay? So it uses, so the E-source will use the term, the designation Elohim for God until Exodus 3, okay? The Elohim source, I will tell you, scholars debate whether this is a real source. Okay, there's a lot of debate about all this stuff. Okay, and the reason is because in the Elohim source seems very fragmentary. Okay, and it's not so much a separate source. Some people wonder if it's like a kind of glue that holds it together. Okay. In the Elohim source, not only is God designated as Elohim until Exodus 3, okay, but God is a little bit more remote than he was in the J source. Okay, he will reveal himself, through things, but not directly. Be it dreams or prophetic messengers such as angels, okay, or through prophets. Okay, indeed, one of the affinities of E is that they really, really, really love the prophets. Okay, they love the prophets as intermediaries of God. Okay, and it is for this reason and for other reasons that a lot of people think that E comes from the north, okay, or Israel or Samaria, okay, because the north is where prophecy is really dominant. Okay, and they date the E source a little later than the J source, okay, to about the 8th or 9th century. Okay. Next source is called the Deuteronomistic source, or the D source. Okay, and if you need a kind of recap of all of this, you can actually read about this in chapter 4 of Kuga. Okay, so the D source, I'm not going to go over D source too much. Basically, the D source is found mainly in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, and the style is very legalistic. It kind of talks about how you should behave, okay, in this covenant between you and God, okay? And one of the main focuses of the D source is that you worship at one place, that the legitimate worship can only happen in this one place, and this is kind of reference to Jerusalem, okay, and the temple in Jerusalem, okay? We know a lot about the D source, which I will talk about sort of later, okay? But we actually can date, most scholars date the D source to the reign of a very specific king of Judah. It was written in Judah, probably under the reign of King Josiah, okay? So, okay. Like I said, the D source is found mainly in Deuteronomy, okay? So you don't, it's not as tricky, okay? Okay. The last source is the P source. Okay, and the P source, the P stands for the priestly source. Okay, and the central kind of features of the P source is that it's interested in things that priests would be interested in, and priests are kind of similar to that. Now, what are they interested in? Well, they're interested in religious observance, ritual, sacrificial systems, Sabbath, holidays, circumcision, dietary restrictions, purity, impurity. They're also interested in kind of lists. Censuses, covenants, genealogies. They're very into genealogies, okay? And there's a reason for some of this, okay? The P source is the latest source, and we think it was written probably in about the 5th or 6th century, meaning that it was written after the exile, after Judah was destroyed and conquered, and its people exiled. Okay, and some of the focus of the P source on, especially genealogies, okay, is because of its time frame. Okay, this was a time when the religious institution was destroyed, and what the P source is doing is kind of writing it down for memory's sake, okay, and writing it down so that when they get to return back to their land, and when they can reinstate the religious system, which is very meaningful, okay, and they can refer back to this text to remember what it should look like, okay. So this is why, in part, they're so interested in ritual and things like that, okay. In the P source, the latest source, God is even more remote than what you find in J, E, and D, okay. He is the most remote. He is transcendent. He's indirect. he never appears directly. Okay, rather he manifests in his glory or as a cloud. Okay, so he is very high. Okay, so this is a very, very, very high God. Okay, or a very transcendent God. Okay, like I said, it is dated to the 5th or 6th century. Okay, it is the latest source. Okay, and think about what you are doing if you are the latest writers of the latest source, right? You're kind of, a lot of people think that P is also responsible for putting the final touches, the final editing of the Hebrew Bible. They may be the ones that really brought the sources together. Okay, and if you are the final, if you get to put the final touches, think about what you're going to do and where you're going to place your own text. Okay, you're going to probably place it in the very beginning. Okay, and this is why scholars think Genesis 1 begins with this very lofty version, this kind of P tale of creation. Okay, so the Hebrew Bible, according to the documentary hypothesis, okay, is therefore the product of centuries of literary activities. Okay, and the purpose of the documentary hypothesis is really to isolate the sources that underlie the Pentateuch. Okay, think about and another kind of designation or term for the documentary hypothesis is the historical criticism. Okay, and the reason why it's called historical criticism is because of documentary hypothesis kind of assumption that once you can isolate the sources, you can kind of put it into a dateline, right? And you can see, once you put it into a dateline, you can kind of see that, figure out the history of Israel, okay? And once you figure out the history of Israel, then you can place the text in its appropriate context. And then by putting it into its appropriate date context, you can figure out what it means. Okay, this is why it's called historical criticism. Okay, however, in the last, I want to say 50 years or so, there's been lots of scholars who wonder about whether some of the assumptions underlying documentary hypothesis is a correct one. Okay, remember I just said the assumption underlying documentary hypothesis is that if you fragment the text, then you can date it. And if you can date it, you can go back to the historical context of the writers who wrote it. And if you go back to the historical context, then you can figure out what the text means. Okay. And what scholars have been, in the last 50 years have been arguing, or wondering about is that really true? When you go back to the original authors and the original context of the author, do you get closer to knowing what the text means, or do you not? Right? Or is the meaning found elsewhere? Okay. Another kind of term for this is, you may have heard of the death of the author. Okay. Some thinkers say, well, no, that's not how texts work, right? If you write the text, once you write the text, the author loses control of its meaning. It doesn't matter what they intended. Okay. The text means what the interpreter means. Okay, not what the author intended. Okay, so there, this is just a kind of small, there's lots of disagreements about the documentary hypothesis. Okay, including the assumptions that underlie it. Okay, when you do that worksheet, there's lots of arguments about the contours of each document. Okay, so there's disagreements about whether this goes into J or whether this is E. Okay, or whether it should be actually P. Okay, and so and notice you have to know how to cut up the source before you can cut up the source. Okay, so when you're cutting up the text, do you are you actually figuring out the documents that underlie it, or are you creating the documents that underlie it? Okay, in short, this is a hypothesis. Okay, you don't have to agree with it. Okay, a lot of people don't, like I said. And yet, I find that, after years of teaching this class, students do find the documentary hypothesis weirdly attractive. Every year I get papers where it basically says, kind of follows the documentary hypothesis, okay? So, for some reason, students do really like it at the end. Whatever you may think about it, it is, of course, really the starting foundation of the study of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so Please fill out the documentary hypothesis worksheet. Please upload it so you can get credit for it. Okay. It should be a kind of a fun worksheet, where you can to try out whether you can also categorize the documents. Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. See you next time.